Hello, my name is Luke Sprague, and I'm with the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'm an oral historian, and today I'm going to take a little time out to teach you oral history interviewing and its ethics, its theory, and its principles. So stay tuned. So, oral history theory is really important, and the reason it's important is it gives you the underlying concepts of why we do what we do as oral historians. And then based upon that theory, you can understand what our practices are and why we do them. That's why we're talking about this. One of the key things that distinguishes oral history from other types of interactions and conversations is that it's deliberate. It's done with a deliberate means of action. You're going to ask the individual, the other person, questions. They can be specific questions. They can also be, and are likely, open-ended questions. But the act itself is deliberate. And this makes oral history different than meeting someone on a street corner and just talking with them and interviewing them ad hoc. Generally, an oral history interview, the questions are written down or you have an idea in your head of those topics that you want to be covered. So it's a deliberate act. That's the first part of an oral history. The second part, in addition to being deliberate, the questions for an oral history interview are generally open-ended in nature. Once you have an open-ended question, you can then probe further on that question. But the questions you're going to ask are deliberate, and they may be particular to that individual and what you think their experiences might have been. So you're asking specific questions, so that helps guide you. The third thing that makes oral history interviews unique is in this tradition of oral history, you document what is said. Usually that's done with a sound recording, and then often that sound recording is made into a written transcription. It can also be made into an index file that indexes the contents of the interview, and it could also be just the recording itself. The trick is you're going to have some type of formal record of the interview that you keep and you maintain, and it's part of the process of what you're doing. The important part of this is making the interview available to others, making it accessible. Now, there are exceptions to that when the narrator, the person you interview, wants the interview restricted. However, for the goal of most oral histories, the intent is to make that interview available to the public. That could be on the internet, that could be on CDs found within a library. It can be found a number of ways. It could be in print format, but basically you're trying to make that content that you created available to the public, assuming there's no restrictions created by the narrator. Another thing to keep in mind is there are numerous oral traditions in the world for passing orally traditions, culture, lifestyles, and they're all valid and they're all equally valuable. So this just happens to be one form, the oral history interview, but be aware of that and respect and try to understand those other oral traditions as well, because they are as equally as valid. And they also point to the validity of being able to pass traditions orally, albeit history, albeit culture, they're all equally valid. So unlike other histories, oral history is a documentation of somebody who was there. We want to get their firsthand experiences. We want to understand through their eyes what happened and what it was like. In oral histories, there is no interpretation, no analysis or synthesis. It is simply documenting what that person's experiences are. And then once the listener receives the material, or listens to the material, then they can decide for themselves, based upon what that person who was there said, what they think about it. That's the entire intent of oral history, to have that person tell you what their experience was. There is also the ideal state that we work towards is not trying to keep our biases as an interviewer out of our questioning, to allow that individual to answer those individual questions. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're doing oral history interviews is to remember that the interview is just one portion of the entire oral history process. You will have things that you have to do after the interview, post-processing, that take hours and hours to complete. The interview is just one portion of the entire process. So keep that in mind when you're doing interviews. So as the interviewer, your job is to guide the interview. Your job is to ask questions. Your job is to not be the focus of the interview. You want to elicit responses from the narrator, and you want them to be able to speak at length on their answers. So as an interviewer, your role is generally not to tell us what you know or what you think you know, but instead to allow the individual who you're interviewing to answer the question completely and fully. So the narrator can also be called another name. Some people call the narrator the interviewee. I prefer the narrator because it's more descriptive. The way to think about the narrator is they're the person that answers your questions, and they are the author of the content. They're the major author. So you want to give them the time and the space to be able to answer any of the questions that you ask. And that's the role of the narrator. So the interviewer is responsible for controlling the flow of the interview. Generally, the interview moves through stages where you start off with a basic set of questions, you go on to a deeper set of questions, and then at some point you wind down the questioning. It's structured in a deliberate way. You may not always stay with that, but you have a framework when you walk into the interview that you work off of. This framework is known as an interview guide. It's also could be called a list of questions. All interviews and the structure of them, the interviewer is responsible for. The oral history interview strives to get fresh reactions from people regarding their experiences. So we tend to find pairing interviewers with narrators who they may not know allows them to delve into memories that would be treated differently than if they were with somebody that they knew. So we're looking for fresh insights there. Those first-hand reactions really become apparent in audio, in oral interviews, either filmed or video or in audio format. Those become apparent, those first-hand reactions do. The other thing that why we would interview a complete stranger is it allows us to get new content and new things that wouldn't have come out otherwise generally, because that individual who's made up that interview guide to do the interview will generally ask questions that may be outside of what the individual is used to. So fresh, new content. The person may have remembered something from 50 or 70 years ago, but their memories of the experience will be fresh. And this comes out in the interview. Another thing to be aware of during the oral history interview is this person is basically reliving that experience in their mind. So the advantage of being able to get the fresh reaction of what their experience is, while valuable from the historian's perspective, also includes the other side of it. If what occurred to them was something not positive, it was bad or negative, that reaction will also be there. So be ready for that. Be ready to work with the narrator and be aware of their feelings and what they're going through during the interview. Okay, so one of the questions that I run into all the time is people who've recorded memoirs. Memoirs, or a self-recorded story, is very different from an oral history interview. A memoir tells me what you want to talk about yourself. And it is different because an oral history interview will ask you often very difficult questions, issues that you may have been struggling with, probing questions, questions that might make you uncomfortable. It is far more balanced. Whereas a memoir, you are telling me what you want me to know about you. And those are two different things. Usually a memoir will have also within it canned narratives and things that are used to being said about your experience. Whereas the oral history interview attempts to avoid that as much as possible, to get away from the canned narrative. The other thing that happens in some cases, not always, very rarely, is the interviewer might lose control of the interview. Not a good situation. In those cases, sometimes what will happen is the narrator will take over the interview and they will start telling you a memoir. That's not the purpose of an oral history interview. The intent of an oral history interview is for the interviewer to control the interview and move the person through the questions and through the interview guide and get good historical content and experiences from that individual, not have them tell them the stories they want necessarily to be heard. They can still be within an oral history interview, but they should be placed contextually in the entire picture of the interview over time. Oral history was meant by design to be approachable. It's meant, unless the narrator has placed restrictions on it, for it to be publicly available. In today's world, that means making it available on the internet to the public so they can listen to it on whatever device they have, whatever connection they have. So it's often found online, and generally, unless there's some form of restriction placed by the narrator, the oral history is available to the public. The other thing that's neat about oral history is we have oral histories of all people from all walks of life. They could be plumbers, they could be anything. They could be from any walk of life, and the intent is to gain their experience, to learn from what their experience of life is. That's what makes oral history really neat. It's flat. It doesn't pick socially the people who are maybe higher in the hierarchy or in a management or directorial type role. It's meant to cover everybody, and that's what makes oral history truly unique. The second part of that is oral history does not interpret what the individual says. Instead, it makes it available to you as an individual so that you can decide what you think about it. Now, there's some discussion within history and historians as a whole in terms of the value of that, of people figuring out what they think, if they do or don't understand the context, and the value of oral history as a whole. But that's more of an academic discussion. It's very important for your oral history interview to have a sound-controlled environment. To the degree that you're able, try and create a quiet space. It could be a conference room, it could be a back room, somewhere you have as little sound as possible other than the communication that's going on between you and the interviewer. You're not always going to be able to control for everything. Sometimes you'll have a train go by that you don't expect. There's not a lot you can do about that. You will also have interruptions that may occur during the interview. You need to be ready for those. But the key is to try and diminish other sound impacts. It could be anything from slamming doors to cuckoo clocks to fluorescent lights. You need to be ready for them and try to minimize their impact if at all possible. Remember, you're recording for history, so your time frame is for a listener not only 5 minutes from now, 5 months from now, 5 years from now, but it could be 50 years from now or 100 years from now that recording will be used by somebody. So you want to make it as best quality as you can. One of the most important things you can do for your oral history interview is to make sure that you are there, the interviewer, with the narrator, and that there aren't necessarily other people in the room. Here's why. If there are other people in the room, let's say a spouse or a partner, the way the narrator answers the questions will change, invariably. So, if at all possible, ask the person to step out or step into the next room. If they refuse to leave, make sure you include in the interview audio that that spouse or person is in the room. That way, people listening to the interview in the future will understand that there is someone else in the room. That's very important because it changes the interview. Make sure you also identify that person by name, especially if they start asking questions. Make sure that they become part of the interview text. The other problem with this is if you have multiple people in the room other than you and just the narrator, the oral history interview can become difficult to manage. So something to be aware of. Be aware that where you conduct the interview also determines how the narrator answers the question. If you ask the narrator questions, if you happen to be interviewing them in their own office, there may be more stressors there or things that would change their answers because they're thinking about themselves being in that role. So to the degree that you're able, it's good if you can interview in a dining room or in a, let's say, a library conference room, somewhere that's as neutral as possible, because you want to take that individual out of a role that's going to affect their answers. So be aware of that, think about it, and be aware that where you interview them also makes a difference. One of the keys to a successful interview, as stated earlier, is making sure that your interview is deliberately structured. It's done with a purpose. It's done with a framework that you walk in with to guide that narrator through that framework. You may not stick to that framework, but you want to use that as a process to guide you through and guide the narrator through. This is very important. Your interview should be structured. There should be specific questions that you'd like to hit, that you'd like to ask. You may get to them, you may not, but you want to start off with a structure to begin with. So in a good oral history program, you will have standards for recording sound. Ideally, you want that to be the highest standard possible. With that said, you want to balance what your program is able to do with that high standard. So you want to strike a balance between the amount of memory in the case of a digital recorder versus the highest quality that you can get. So it's kind of an art form. The second thing is if you have a formal program, which you should, you're going to have standards for preservation. Usually that's the creation of a WAV file, and then you're going to have standards for access, which usually is the creation of an MP3 file, where you're getting that audio content out to the public in some shape or form. It could also be in a CD format, a CDA file dropped on a CD. So it can vary quite a bit, but be aware and do your homework in terms of what your standard for your program is going to be prior to recording on site. Generally, when you do an oral history interview, it's part of a larger program, and that oral history program has formal processes and workflows that it goes through. So just be aware of that, and that's very important. Having a formalized process when you have a larger program. It's not as important when you have a smaller program, but it's very important as a program gets larger to document and have those processes documented, just to keep everything in order and make sure you've done everything you need to do. This next section is oral history, principles, and ethics. Rule number 1 is to respect the individual who you're interviewing. There are a number of factors that go into this, and we're going to talk about all of them. Be ready to be surprised. The person may have different perspectives than you on a particular issue. That's okay. That's their story. Your job is not, as an interviewer, to get in an argument with them or determine or decide or give us your opinion. Your job is to simply document their perspective. Also, to respect their dignity, regardless of what their situation is. Your job is to work with that and try to get their story, their narrative documented for history. The next thing is their privacy. If they've asked for their name to be withheld for privacy reasons, that's perfectly acceptable. Respect the individual's privacy. And lastly, respect the individual's safety. If it turns out that, as in our case when we're interviewing veterans, that the veteran is not able to continue on as a result of the questions you're asking during the interview, try and respect that and stop the interview if they're triggered or if there's some type of reaction. This can also happen if there was some type of trauma inflicted on the individual who you're interviewing. Just be aware of that and be cognizant of the fact that you're going to have all different kinds of people from all different walks of life, and be ready to roll with and deal with wherever they're coming from in terms of responding to your question. One key thing to remember is that when the narrator is talking to you and answering questions about their experience, they are literally in their mind reliving the experience. So be aware of that and be ready for it and respect whatever is going on and be present to that experience. A good interviewer knows that preparation is key to a successful interview. And one of those keys is doing research on the narrator, understanding where they've been, who they are, what their experiences might have been, and what events they may have been involved with historically. So careful preparation is key. Also important is being transparent with that narrator, being straight up with them and saying, this is what I'm going to do during the interview, and this is how we're going to do it. Be honest with them, be straight up, and the narrator will respect you, both for researching them, understanding where they're coming from, and also being honest with them about what you're going to do during the interview. During the interview, you want as few surprises as possible. To improve the quality of the interview, you want to as closely match the narrator and the interviewer, especially in terms of if there are big differences in power. You want to have them similar in power levels so that the interviewer and the narrator are not feeling a differential there. They're acting as peers talking to each other. That usually yields a better interview. Also be aware the narrator has the full right of refusal, which means if they say, I want to stop the interview, that's it, the interview ends. If the narrator says, I want you to eliminate a piece of the interview, you have to honor that. So be aware of that. The narrator is basically the author. So if there's anything they say they don't want or they want eliminated, you have to respect that. They have the full right of refusal. You could go through the entire interview, reach the end, and they can say, I don't want you to have this interview. And that's it. You have to respect that. So in our program, what we do is we have the narrator and the interviewer both sign the deed of gift following the interview. Some programs put that deed of gift signature at the beginning. We prefer to do it at the end, where the narrator still has the ability to say, no, I don't want you to have this. So in doing that, one of the processes that we do is we make sure during the pre-interview phone call that the narrator completely understands what we're going to do or not do with the interview before the interview. So as a sidebar, one of the things to keep in mind is you need both the signature of the narrator and the interviewer. It turns out that although the narrator is the primary or major author, the interviewer is also a minor author of that oral history interview. And for copyright purposes, you need both of their signatures to release that interview to your organization. So make sure you have either two forms or one form with both of their signatures on it. One of the key processes that we use in our oral history interview workflow is what's called the pre-interview phone call. And the pre-interview phone call gives you an opportunity to make sure that that narrator understands what's going to happen to the interview. So we literally walk them through how the interview is going to happen and what it's going to look like. We also, at that same time, in terms of informed consent, make sure that we agree on and that we're clear, at least verbally initially, on what the possible usages of that interview are. That it's going to be made public, that it's going to be placed online, or it's not going to be put online, or it's not going to be made publicly available. Those exclusions and restrictions by the narrator are discussions you should have even before you get in the interview room. So you want to have those during the pre-interview phone call. You should also at that time make them aware of if they libel or slander someone on that voluntary interview with you, that there could be repercussions from that interview, and they should be aware of them. So make sure they're aware of it. Also make sure that they're aware that they can place restrictions. They can restrict down to a word within an interview. They can restrict access. There's any number of combinations of restrictions both to the content and to access that a narrator can make. And whatever those restrictions are, you should honor those. Hi, so this is Luke Sprague at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Thank you for taking time out of your day today to listen to this very short class on oral history interview, principles, and ethics. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me at the address listed there or send me a letter. Thank you.